Hello, I'm Fred Stella, President of Interfaith Dialogue Association. Welcome to another edition of Common Threads. So every few years, all of us who are religion nerds get really excited when we hear that the latest Pew Research Survey on faith in America comes out. That paints the most current landscape and helps us understand how populations are drawn toward or away from communities. Well, a new one is out, and I wanted to speak to someone who might have some insight on the numbers and trends. Well, I asked, and I received. The website Religion News Service has a great piece by Reverend Wes Granberg-Michaelson. As soon as I read it, I realized I wanted him on the show here. But it wasn't until I started seeking him out online that I found he has a significant West Michigan connection. And after trading a few emails, it turns out he also authored a couple of books that I think are worthy of some conversation. So a little bit about Reverend Wesley Granberg-Michaelson. He is a global ecumenical leader whose work has highlighted the intersection of faith with public life. He was a legislative assistant to Senator Mark Hatfield, director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches, and served for 17 years as General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America. He chairs the Board of Sojourners, an advocacy ministry linking faith and social justice. He also serves on the boards of Church Innovations Institute and Global Christian Forum. His books include How Change Comes to Your Church, Future Faith, and the book we'll be discussing today, Without Oars. So we welcome to Common Threads, Reverend Wes Granberg-Michaelson. Hello, Wes.
Hey, Fred. Really good to hear you. Thanks very much for your generous invitation.
My pleasure. So, as I mentioned just a second ago, the main purpose of me contacting you and having you on as a guest was the survey, but then you sent me this wonderful book, Without Oars, and so I'm thinking, we might talk about the survey first, but then again, you could bring up something that Without Oars has meaning for, and so if we end up going back and forth, nobody's going to dock our pay. That's the good news. So why don't we do that? Let's talk about the survey up front, for at least right now, and tell me, is the Pew Survey something that you always look forward to, as I do, and always try to make sense of?
Yes, I do, Fred. And I try to pay attention to the numbers. I served for, as you said, 17 years as General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America, and of course, that's when I spent a lot of time living in Grand Rapids, and I had to really familiarize myself with the larger ocean in which the congregations of the RCA were swimming, and what were the overall trends that we would be affected by and had to be alert to. And for that reason, I gave a lot of attention to the work of the Pew Institute, their fine research, also the stuff that would come out from Gallup and from other places, to try not just to talk about hopes, but to talk about actual data and to see what it was that congregations in the United States are faced with today.
So when you were the General Secretary, is that anything like Pope?
Well,
I mean, is it the closest thing? Is it the closest thing?
Yeah, it would be if we weren't Protestants, I like to tell people that being a General Secretary, first, the name was really good because half the church wants me to be a general and half the church wants me to be a secretary, and they can't make up their mind. And the second thing is that it's just like being a bishop or an archbishop, except you don't get the hat, you don't get the frills, you just get the work.
Oh, geez. They don't give you a hat? Well, God bless you.
But it's part, the Reformed tradition, as you know, Fred. We kind of rejected the notion of bishops and of hierarchy. So a lot of our bishops are, exercise their own role informally rather than through some position or title they have.
Sure, I understand that. Can we flesh out these numbers more to make better sense of things in this current survey? You say we have 350,000 Christian congregations in the country, and 90% have a profile older than the current population. If you were General Secretary right now, what would that say to you, and what would be your response and your concern?
Yeah, well, this is, I think, one of the more important pieces of data that I've come across in my work and my writing. You look at the U.S. population and you say, well, how many people are between the ages of 18 and about 30? And you come up with it's somewhere around 18-20%. When the new census data comes out, we'll have that, up to date and precise. But then you say, well, how many congregations reflect that same demographic picture? And it turns out there's only 1 in 10. So it means 9 out of 10 congregations today have an age span, on average, that's older than the population itself. So right away, you know that we're facing these demographic headwinds. People have all kinds of reasons of, well, why are numbers declining? Why are there less people in church today than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago? And that's one of the main findings that, made a lot of headlines when it came out last month. Less than half of Americans now are actively involved as members of a congregation or a house of worship. Well, one reason is simply because people are dying, and because the average age of our congregations is older. And so congregations aren't being replaced at the same rate in which people are being lost from their membership. Now, there are other factors as well that we can go into, but you start by saying we're facing these demographic headwinds, and that means you have to ask these deeper questions. Why is it that those who are of a younger generation have less interest in being part of a church today? And exactly how does that break down? How does that break down across race, which is something that we often don't look at? And where are the places where religious interest or spiritual curiosity is being expressed by those people? And what might the church do in response? So those are some of the questions that I would ask today. Some of the same questions we did ask when I was serving in that role, but I think which any denomination has to ask today, including the Reformed Church in America.
There are some congregations I know, particularly the megachurches, non-denominational, and it seems as if they look at these surveys the same way Madison Avenue might look at a survey. If they're marketing a product, it could be soap, anything, and then they attempt to turn their church community into what they believe will match the demographics. And so, for instance, as I'm sure you know, a lot of these newer congregations, they seem like the anti-church. I'm not speaking theologically, but in terms of their presentation, rock and roll music, a coffee bar, and all of that. And so they try to mold to that. And then there are other congregations, I would say most, certainly mainline, they choose not to change all that much. So is there a balance that you can see that some people are taking to make it more, say, family-friendly, youth-friendly, at the same time not turning it into a disco club?
Yeah, I mean those are tensions and questions that practically every congregation is facing in one way or another. But I think, Fred, that they often don't get to the heart of the matter. There are two ways that people think. People who study congregations or who have responsibility for trying to help organize them or lead them as a whole. Two ways in which congregations can be classified. The one is to say that congregations have an attractional model. an attractional model. In other words, what they want to do is exactly what you've said. They want to attract as many people in as they can. And so they'll do whatever they need to. They'll change the music. They'll change the lighting. They'll get best video. They'll get the, hippest music. They'll put in those coffee bars. They'll do whatever they think might work. And the bigger the church, the more the more options they have. They'll form every kind of special interest group they could dream of in order to have something for people to get engaged with. And that's been popular amongst many of the kinds of churches and some of those you described. But there's a critique about that, and there's another way as well. The critique is, you could bring people in for a good show, but is that really what it's all about? And what are you really doing to instill a depth of discipleship in such people? And is the whole point just to get people in the door? The other model I would call, and others classify as a missional model. And that's where a congregation says, look, what we exist for is what happens to people when they walk out of the door of our church and leave the service and go into the world. It's how we make an impact in society. And we've got to remember that it's not that the church has God's mission, but that God has a mission and happens to have a church. In other words, it's our responsibility to figure out how we make an impact in a society around us. And that is what will finally draw people to the church. And when you look at the younger population that people talk about so much, they talk about the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, meaning those who, when you do a survey and you say, what organized religion are you a part of, they reply, none. And that number has risen amongst millennials and is getting a lot of attention. It's now up to upwards of 35% of younger people. But when you say to those same people, so you just don't go to church because you don't believe in God? You say, no. Only 23% of them say they don't believe in God. And many of them have a lot of spiritual curiosity. But what they want to see is not what the church says or not the show that it puts on. They want to see what people who are in the church do when they're in society. They want to see a church that has some integrity in doing what it says it believes. And churches that organize themselves that way, around what I'd call a missional model, I think in the long run they have a far better chance of attracting those who feel disaffected. And the last 4 years of politics in our country has, in fact, accentuated that more. People, especially a younger generation, they're tired of hearing what a church says. They want to see what a church does, and they want to see whether its actions can match up to its words.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Common Threads on WGVU. My name is Fred Stella, and with me today is Reverend Wes Granberg-Michaelson. He is former General Secretary for the Reformed Church in America, and at the moment we're discussing the Pew Survey on religious life in America. So, now, you mentioned that there is something like, what was that number you gave? Like 10% of the congregations in the country reflect the population age profile. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Fred.
Okay. Do you know who those people are? And do they is what they're doing a reflection of what you just offered as a successful congregation?
I think it's probably varied, and I don't know if there's been a lot of the careful study of churches that have a different demographic profile, as I've said. But I would say that at least anecdotally, those churches that have a younger profile, they're not simply churches that have 55-year-olds playing rock music, even though the music style is likely to be different, likely to be a little less traditional. But I think they are churches that have opportunities for engagement in the society at large. They're churches that are offering opportunities for people to be involved in a kind of outward ministry that seems to make a difference around people's needs. Churches that offer opportunities for exposure trips to different parts of the world that engages people in realities of need and of suffering. Churches that offer the opportunity for people to show and demonstrate a commitment to love one's neighbor, rather than churches that focus first on trying to get one to agree to the proper set of beliefs. So I think in general, churches that are able to attract a younger generation are churches that have more of those opportunities.
You mentioned the past 4 years and the challenges that we as a country experienced. I'm wondering if, and you would probably have to read between the lines in the survey to flesh this out, but I'm assuming you might have that capability. I certainly wouldn't. Do we know if the Trump experience fortified evangelicals? Now, I know, and by that I don't mean individually, because I'm sure a lot of evangelicals who are very far to the right from the center, I'm sure they personally feel fortified. But in terms of fortifying the population, do we know if people actually came into the evangelical movement because of Trump and his allies, particularly those evangelical ministers that he placed in positions connected to power?
Well, I think you saw a couple things going on, Fred, and there's been an awful lot of attention, and we're just beginning to get some of the research around the facts here. First of all, it's clear that a high percentage of white evangelicals, and I want to underscore white evangelicals, were supporters of President Trump. Now, that number, from what most of the polling data shows, was slightly less than it was 4 years ago, but remained in that high range of around in the high 70% up to about 80%, although it looks like there was some decrease. At the same time, it's also clear that there has been an exodus of some who would call themselves evangelical, but because of their aversion to the mingling of Trump's policies and Christian beliefs, their rejection of that meant that they stepped away from that identification. And here's the interesting thing: the term evangelical used to be defined theologically. Evangelicals believed in certain things theologically. But what's happened more recently is that the term is defined more socially and culturally. And so when a person says they're evangelical, it has more to do with where their political and cultural attitudes are rather than in their beliefs. And when those people then leave in a church that finds itself as evangelical, they then no longer call themselves evangelical. So that means it's even more difficult for researchers to figure all this out. But there is one other interesting statistic that also came to light just in the past few months, and that is that mainline denominations over the past couple of years actually increased from about 10.2% to 10.6% of the Christian community.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that and was quite interested in it. What is your take on that?
Well, people, we're still trying to figure that out, but it's a definite uptick compared to the general decline over many years. We'll need to have more data to form really clear conclusions, but the general sense is that it probably reflects people who are walking away from a more, from a more right-wing evangelical identification, wanting to remain Christian and finding themselves more comfortable in what we typically have called a mainline congregation, and it's going to be a trend well worth watching. We also have some statistics that show that in certain areas, and West Michigan, frankly, is one of them, where the percentage of those who typically voted Republican amongst the Christian community, you saw a shift away it may only be 2 or 3 or 4%, but a shift away during this past election, which represented those who were not wanting to go along with a strong identification with Donald Trump. So I think the evangelical community as a whole is in great flux. I frankly think it has terrific problems today within the U.S. Its brand has been really associated strongly with one particular political expression, and that's causing problems. It's particularly causing problems amongst those who are younger, and it's going to be a challenge to see where that goes in the future.
And then, of course, you have people like your colleague Jim Wallace who identify as evangelicals, and they're pounding the table saying, "Hey, it isn't a sociopolitical label; it is a theological label, and yes, you can be moderate and even liberal and be an evangelical."
That's been a long voice. You mentioned that I began working for Senator Mark Hatfield at the beginning of my career before I went into the ministry. He was an evangelical, and he was called a liberal Republican. I'm not sure whether he would fit either of those categories today. Liberal Republicans barely exist, but there's been a long tradition of other voices in the evangelical community. They've been minority voices. They haven't been in the majority by any means, but they've been saying exactly what you've suggested, Fred. And the other thing is that what we often don't realize, when you look at this question through the lens of race, you see something very differently. When you look at African Americans or Latinx who classify themselves as evangelical, you often will find a different stance on social and political issues. And so it is more the case that you're talking about white evangelicals when you are referring to those who seem to have a strong affinity for the kinds of policies and view that President Trump espoused.
You say you don't know if liberal Republicans exist. I can tell you here in West Michigan, we have one on display at the Public Museum right next to the Tyrannosaurus Rex bones. So we just have a couple of minutes left. Wes, if you can answer this very quickly. About the Catholic population, what do we know about the sex abuse scandal and the number of Catholics leaving? I know many angry Catholics, rightfully so, because of this, but I honestly don't know if I am aware of any who left because of that. But does the survey actually indicate that Catholics have left specifically because of that?
No, the survey doesn't go into that much, but other data does, and I have analyzed and written about that. When you look at the Catholic Church, the thing to remember is that Catholicism in the United States is being sustained by immigration. The number of Catholics who are Hispanic continues to increase. When you look at Catholic millennials, okay, again, we talk about that younger age group. You look at Catholic millennials, 52% of them are Hispanic, or we could say Latinx. And this shows the trajectory of Catholicism in the United States. If it weren't for immigration and weren't for the presence of Hispanic believers in the Catholic Church would be in utter free fall. There are many who are leaving the Catholic Church, as you say, over the issue of the sex abuse scandal.
Then, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Finish your thought, then we'll have to.
But the general population, Catholicism is about 23% of the U.S. population, and that's generally steady. So you've got those leaving, but you have others coming into the Catholic faith.
I'm glad you did finish that statement. Thank you. Wes, we are down to the wire for this episode, but there's so much more to talk about. And yes, next week we will get to your book, which I appreciated very much. So, Wes, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Fred. I've appreciated it and enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Common Threads here on WGVU. I'm Fred Stella, and with me today has been Reverend Wes Granberg-Michaelson, and we will continue our conversation with him next week right here on WGVU.